In collective memory, there are farewells that fail to close. There are names that, even after the official silence, continue to return with an uncomfortable persistence, as if something had remained suspended between what was said and what was hidden. Yu Menglong is one of those names. A young artist whose public image was always associated with calmness and closeness, but whose absence, far from dissipating over time, has begun to generate an increasingly deep unease. Almost 100 days have passed since that day in September when his departure was announced. For many, the file has already been archived, official explanations have marked a final point, and the industry has continued to move forward with its usual rhythm. However, for a significant part of the public, this supposed closure has not brought relief, but new questions. In several East Asian cultures, the 100th day does not only symbolize the end of mourning, but also the moment when memory is transformed and demands to be understood. It is not a final goodbye, but a threshold. That threshold was crossed in an unexpected way. From Taiwan to Thailand, and later in Malaysia, spontaneous commemoration ceremonies began to emerge. They did not respond to official campaigns or media strategies. They were intimate acts sustained by people who did not accept that the story be reduced to a press release. Photographs, flowers, prayers, and everyday objects occupied those spaces. In silence, these gatherings posed an uncomfortable question. If everything was resolved, why did so many people feel that something remained unanswered? As the days went by, the conversation stopped focusing solely on memory. Seemingly minor details began to appear, scattered fragments that, when observed as a whole, acquired a different weight. Subtle changes in a musical interpretation. Interrupted gestures in public encounters. Images that, out of context, seemed insignificant, but began to be revisited with almost microscopic attention. Not as definitive proof, but as signs of a latent discomfort. This phenomenon cannot be understood only as an act of nostalgia. It reflects a broader tension between the official narrative and social perception. In an environment where information circulates in a fragmented and unequal manner, gaps tend to be filled with interpretations. When explanations fail to generate trust, the public does not remain silent. It observes, compares, and connects. This analysis does not seek to dictate conclusions or replace the role of institutions. Nor does it intend to fuel unfounded speculation. Its purpose is different: to examine how and why, in certain cases, collective memory refuses to close a story. We will analyze the clues that have kept the conversation alive, the power dynamics that condition individual freedom in the entertainment industry, and the reasons why certain stories, even after being declared concluded, continue to resonate strongly. Because behind the glamour and the official versions, an essential question remains. What happens when a voice cannot express itself directly and only leaves scattered traces to be interpreted by those observing from the outside? In environments where direct speech becomes a risk, silence is rarely absolute. Throughout history, when open expression has been limited by power structures, people have resorted to alternative forms of communication. Minimal gestures, almost imperceptible deviations, seemingly trivial choices that, observed out of context, go unnoticed but acquire another meaning when placed within a broader sequence. In the case of Yu Menglong, a part of the public debate has concentrated precisely on that ambiguous terrain, that of indirect signs. One of the most commented elements has been his interpretation of a widely known song. It is not an original work, but a classic theme whose lyrics have been sung for years without relevant variations. However, in his version, some listeners perceived a minimal alteration in the pronunciation of a key phrase. From a strictly technical point of view, phonetic differences in singing can be due to multiple factors: vocal style, breathing, emotional emphasis, or even limitations inherent to live performance. None of this constitutes by itself proof of intent. Nonetheless, the public's reaction reveals something deeper. The discussion does not revolve solely around whether the word was changed consciously or accidentally, but how it was emotionally interpreted. A phrase that, in its usual form, expresses resignation to fate, came to be heard as an affirmation of a lack of personal control. For some listeners, that difference transformed the complete meaning of the verse. It stopped being a passive declaration to become the suggestion of a life managed by others. This type of reading does not arise in a vacuum. It appears when there is a prior perception of restriction. In contexts where it is assumed that a person does not possess full autonomy over their career, their public appearances, or even their discourse, any deviation acquires a symbolic value. Not because it necessarily is one, but because the public's emotional environment is predisposed to seek signs. Added to this analysis are images and videos released before his death. In one of them, Yu Menglong appears interacting with fans during an autograph signing. The scene is brief and seemingly everyday. However, at a specific moment, a member of his entourage physically intervenes to interrupt the interaction. From an objective perspective, this type of intervention may be due to logistical, security, or scheduling reasons. In the entertainment industry, times are strictly controlled and representatives often act quickly to fulfill prior commitments. However, public perception is rarely limited to the functional. The image of an interrupted gesture, of a hand withdrawn before completing an action as simple as signing an autograph, was interpreted by many as a symbol of constant surveillance. The question that emerged was not whether the action was justified, but why it generated such an intense feeling of discomfort. The answer seems to be related to the accumulation of small, similar episodes, rather than a single isolated act. At this point, it is relevant to introduce the concept of restricted language. When people feel they cannot express disagreement, fatigue, or frustration openly, they develop indirect forms of communication. These are not always conscious or strategic. Sometimes they manifest in the choice of a song, in the intonation of a phrase, or in a gaze held longer than usual. The external observer, especially one who feels an emotional connection with the public figure, tends to interpret these gestures as coded messages. Another element that fueled this type of interpretation was the circulation of certain artistic images associated with his professional environment. Photographs of a dark atmosphere with oppressive visual compositions began to be revisited under a new light. In them, some viewers believed they recognized dynamics of domination or loss of control. From an analytical approach, it is fundamental to emphasize that art, by definition, admits multiple readings. Images do not explain their context on their own, and without additional information, any interpretation remains in the realm of subjectivity. Even so, the insistence with which these images were shared reveals a collective unease. It was not just about reconstructing the facts, but about understanding an emotional experience. The implicit question was whether those representations reflected internal states of prolonged pressure or simply responded to aesthetic decisions detached from the artist's personal life. In this process, the online community assumed an active role. Users from different countries began to collect fragments, order timelines, and compare behaviors. This phenomenon does not equate to a formal investigation, but it does show how, in the absence of explanations considered satisfactory, the public attempts to fill the information gaps. Every detail, however minimal, becomes a potential piece of a larger puzzle. The risk of this approach is evident. Excessive interpretation can lead to conclusions that are not backed by verifiable facts. However, to completely ignore these readings would also be to oversimplify the phenomenon. What is at stake is not only the veracity of each sign, but the reason why so many people feel the need to look for them. That need points to a structural distrust and the perception that certain stories are not told in their entirety. Ultimately, these clues do not constitute an accusation or conclusive proof. They function more as reflections of an underlying tension between the public image and the private experience. When a figure seems to lack a clear space to express themselves, the public becomes an interpreter. It does not always get it right, but its insistence reveals a question that remains open. To what extent can a person within a highly regulated system decide for themselves? This question is not limited to an individual case. It extends to an entire industry in which public visibility is high, but autonomy is not always proportional. And it is precisely this uncertainty that keeps the conversation alive, even when official answers have already been pronounced. When private conversation is transformed into a public debate, the impact rarely remains contained. In the case of Yu Menglong, the transition from intimate memory to collective discussion occurred progressively, yet constantly. The 100-day commemoration ceremonies did not only function as acts of symbolic farewell, but as catalysts for a broader social reaction. What began as a gesture of affection ended up becoming a wave of attention that crossed borders and digital platforms. From a sociological perspective, this phenomenon responds to a known dynamic. When an official narrative attempts to close an episode while a significant part of the public perceives that there are unexplained aspects, a trust gap is produced. That gap is the space where speculation settles, but also emotional mobilization. The commemorative meetings in different countries did not share a centralized coordination. They were autonomous expressions that, by repeating themselves in different cultural contexts, acquired a collective meaning. The reiteration transformed the individual gesture into a shared message. The reaction on social media was immediate. Images of improvised altars, lit candles, and prayers circulated alongside messages appealing to memory and symbolic justice. At this point, the language used is revealing. Most comments avoided direct accusations. Instead, they were articulated around open questions, expressions of concern, and calls not to forget. This form of discourse suggests a clear awareness of legal limits and, at the same time, a resistance to accepting silence as a sufficient response. In parallel, two clearly differentiated currents of opinion began to consolidate. On one hand, those who considered it necessary to continue observing, collecting information, and keeping the discussion alive. For this group, the passage of time did not justify the premature closure of the debate. They argued that public memory fulfills a monitoring function when institutions fail to generate full trust. On the other hand, a stance emerged that defended the need to stop the scrutiny, pointing out the risk of transforming mourning into a source of constant speculation. According to this view, insisting on the details could end up affecting people unrelated to the facts and perpetuating the pain. This polarization is not exceptional. It frequently appears in situations where the public figure is at the center of a tragedy. However, in this case, the division was amplified by the perception of unequal informational control. Some users began to point out the disappearance of content, the difficulty in accessing certain discussions, and the absence of prolonged media follow-up. Without attributing specific intentions, they described a scenario in which information seemed fragmented and, in certain spaces, limited. The response to this sensation was the spontaneous organization of symbolic initiatives. One of them was the circulation of international petitions requesting greater transparency. Beyond the exact number of signatures, these actions functioned as emotional indicators. They did not intend to substitute legal processes or impose conclusions, but to make a demand visible, the demand to be heard. In contexts where access to complete information is perceived as insufficient, signing a petition becomes an act of participation, even when its practical impact is uncertain. The effect of this prolonged exposure was also reflected in the retrospective review of Yu Menglong's professional career. Users began to analyze periods of media absence, unrealized projects, and career decisions that at the time had passed without much attention. The recurring question was not why certain events occurred, but under what conditions certain decisions were made. Again, it was not about establishing guilt, but about understanding dynamics. In this analysis, a key concept emerged: power asymmetry. The entertainment industry is characterized by a hierarchical structure in which public visibility does not always translate into decision-making capacity. Contracts, agencies, and networks of influence configure an environment where individual options can be restricted. This reality, known by many professionals in the sector, is rarely discussed openly in the public space. When a concrete case seems to illustrate that tension, interest multiplies. The media avalanche, however, was not uniform. While in some regions the conversation intensified, in others it seemed to dilute quickly. This disparity reinforced the perception that the flow of information does not respond only to public interest, but also to structural factors. The lack of continuity in coverage did not eliminate the questions. It simply displaced them to other less visible but equally active spaces. It is important to note that this type of dynamic carries evident risks. Constant exposure can lead to unverifiable theories and the attribution of meanings that exceed the available data. Nonetheless, to reduce the phenomenon to a simple emotional reaction would be insufficient. The persistence of the debate indicates a collective need to understand how certain mechanisms work and what their human consequences are. In this context, the figure of Yu Menglong stopped being only that of an artist remembered with affection. It transformed into a point of reference for a broader conversation about limits, control, and responsibility. The discussion no longer revolved exclusively around his personal story, but around a system that, for many, remains opaque. The question that remained suspended after this wave of attention was not whether all suspicions were well-founded, but why so many people felt they could not accept the official account without reservation. That distance between the institutional version and public perception is the true core of the debate. As long as that distance persists, the conversation will continue to reappear, even when the media noise decreases. There are moments when an individual story stops being perceived as an isolated fact and begins to be read as part of a broader pattern. In the public debate surrounding the case of Yu Menglong, that turning point occurred when his name began to appear alongside that of another artist whose death, years ago, had generated similar questions: Chao Renliang. The association did not arise from an official statement or an academic analysis, but from collective memory, which tends to establish connections when it perceives repeated structures. The commemorative act held in Malaysia, where both names were remembered in the same symbolic space, had a particular impact. For some attendees, it was simply an emotional coincidence, a joint tribute to two beloved figures. For others, that gesture reinforced the feeling that there were parallels difficult to ignore. It was not a matter of claiming that the circumstances were identical, but of observing similarities in the way both cases were assimilated by the industry and the public. From there, more detailed comparisons began to circulate. In the case of Chao Renliang, old interviews, social media posts, and artistic works created before his death were reviewed. Some fragments, which at the time had been interpreted as creative expressions or trivial comments, acquired new meanings when recontextualized. This retrospective reinterpretation is a known phenomenon in cultural analysis. When the outcome of a story is tragic, the past is re-examined in search of premonitory signs. One of the most discussed elements was the recurring use of certain visual symbols in his creations and publications. Images of animals, specific chromatic references, and compositions that evoked isolation or surveillance were the object of multiple readings. From a strictly analytical perspective, it is fundamental to emphasize that symbols do not possess a fixed meaning. Their interpretation depends on the cultural framework, the creator's personal context, and the historical moment in which they are observed. Even so, the public's insistence on relating them to a narrative of constant pressure reveals a need for meaning. This process of association intensified with the appearance of theories proposing the existence of hidden dynamics within the entertainment industry. In these accounts, the emphasis did not fall so much on specific individuals as on impersonal structures, rigid contracts, prolonged dependency relationships, and hierarchies where decision-making capacity is concentrated in a few actors. These theories did not offer conclusive proof, but they did articulate a shared concern, the suspicion that visible success can coexist with profound vulnerability. It is at this point where the analysis must maintain a critical distance. Linking different cases involves the risk of simplifying complex realities and projecting the same explanation onto circumstances that may differ substantially. However, to ignore these associations entirely also prevents understanding the social phenomenon in its totality. The relevant question is not whether all connections established by the public are correct, but why they result plausible for so many people? The answer seems to lie in the perceived opacity of the system. When the internal mechanisms of an industry are not transparent, the space for interpretation expands. The lack of clear information not only fuels speculation, but also generates a sense of lack of protection. In that context, every story that ends abruptly reinforces the idea that there are unaddressed structural risks. Some observers have described this phenomenon as an accumulative narrative. Each new case is not evaluated in isolation, but is added to a previous emotional archive. Past experiences condition the way present events are interpreted. Thus, the memory of Chao Renliang becomes a lens through which the case of Yu Menglong is observed. Not as a direct equivalence, but as an antecedent that intensifies suspicion. In the midst of this climate, voices also emerged appealing for prudence. They reminded that excessive analogies can blur the uniqueness of each life and reduce it to a symbol. They emphasized the importance of not turning pain into a closed narrative that, paradoxically, ends up imposing a single meaning on experiences that were perhaps more complex. These interventions introduced a necessary counterpoint, remembering that the search for patterns must not override the responsibility to distinguish. However, even these calls for caution recognized a central point. Psychological pressure within highly regulated environments is a documented reality. The constant demand for performance, permanent public exposure, and dependence on rigid contractual structures create a scenario where the margin for personal error is drastically reduced. In that sense, the comparison between cases functions less as a specific accusation and more as a systemic critique. The climax of this reflection is not found in a definitive revelation, but in an awakening of awareness. The collective discussion began to shift from the question, "What exactly occurred?" toward a broader one, "What conditions allow these stories to be repeated?" This change of focus marks a turning point. It is no longer only about clarifying a case, but about examining a model. In this scenario, the figure of Yu Menglong acquires a symbolic dimension. He represents not only an individual remembered with affection, but a generation of artists who operate within systems where visibility does not guarantee emotional protection or real autonomy. The association with other names reinforces this reading, even if it does not offer definitive answers. At the end of this journey, what remains is not a closed conclusion, but a sense of informed unease. The public does not demand absolute certainties, but the possibility of better understanding the limits and responsibilities of an environment that, in its external shine, hides deep tensions. As long as those tensions are not addressed openly, comparisons will continue to emerge, and stories will continue to intertwine in collective memory. Reaching this point, it is evident that the story of Yu Menglong cannot be reduced to a sequence of dates or a final communique. Nor can it be enclosed in a single interpretation. What remains, beyond the debated details and the hypotheses raised, is a persistent sense of incompleteness. A shared perception that something essential remained unsaid, or perhaps was unable to be said. With the passage of time, the figure of Yu Menglong has transcended his identity as an artist. He has become an involuntary symbol of a broader tension, the one that exists between the carefully constructed public image and the private experience of those who inhabit the center of the show. His story invites reflection on the price of visibility in an environment where success does not always translate into autonomy, and where personal decisions can remain diluted within complex and hierarchical structures. The true impact of this case does not lie solely in the question of what occurred, but in what it reveals about the functioning of the system. A system that demands constant results, that rewards discipline and obedience, and that rarely exposes with clarity the mechanisms that sustain it. In that context, human fragility runs the risk of being relegated to the background, eclipsed by figures, contracts, and market strategies. Collective memory has played a decisive role here. By refusing to forget, the public not only pays tribute to a life, but also exercises a form of symbolic vigilance. It is not about dictating verdicts or substituting institutional processes, but about keeping open the questions that allow for critical scrutiny. Remembering, in this sense, becomes an act of shared responsibility. The lesson that emerges from this story goes beyond a proper name. It reminds us that no individual, whether a public figure or an anonymous person, should be reduced to a function within an impersonal machinery. It also poses a warning about the limits of social tolerance toward opacity. When explanations fail to generate trust, uncertainty does not disappear. It transforms and seeks new spaces to express itself. Looking toward the future, it is likely that similar debates will continue to emerge. The entertainment industry, like any system of high exposure, faces the challenge of reconciling efficiency with human care. The question is not whether these conversations are uncomfortable, but whether they can open the door to greater reflection on responsibility, transparency, and emotional well-being. Ultimately, each viewer will decide how to interpret this story. Some will opt for caution, others for persistent doubt. Both stances coexist in the same space of reflection. What is essential is to recognize that questioning is not equivalent to condemning, and remembering does not imply clinging to the past. It means rather resisting indifference. Because as long as there are stories that fail to close entirely, memory will continue to demand attention. And in that act of looking directly at what is uncomfortable, perhaps the possibility of a more conscious change may be found.